Well, now that the first semifinal debate has concluded, we welcome the debate teams that will compete in the second semifinal debate. Potomac Oak from Rockville, Maryland will compete against EEC Debate from Toronto, Canada. At this time, I'd like to ask our debaters to please introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Jonathan. I will be the first speaker for Potomac, and I'm really excited to be here.
Hi everyone, I'm Lily. I'll be the second speaker for Potomac on the AF, and I'm very honored to have this opportunity to speak in front of you all.
I'm Alex. I'll be the. Hello?
You have to go closer.
Hello? Is it okay? Hi, I'm Alex. I'll be the third speaker for Potomac. I'm equally excited to be here, and I can't wait to have this debate.
Hi, my name is Kaylee. I will be the first speaker on the negative, and I represent EEC Debate. I'm very honored to be here.
Second for EEC Debate, negative Tanush.
Third is Sarah, also for EEC.
Let's give a big round of applause to our students. Once again, moderating this round will be Mr. David Baker, Director of Admission and Financial Aid at St. Mark's School of Texas. And now to introduce our judges. Mr. Miha Andrić is an international communication, speech, and debate teacher, philosopher, and sociologist based in Slovenia. He's currently the director of the Education Center Argument, a board member of the International Philosophy Olympiad, and a board member of Dialexicon. He has trained students, teachers, and professionals from the business world in more than 50 countries around the globe. Mr. Andrić is a member of the IPPF Advisory Board. Mr. Will Baker is the director of the NYU Global Debate Program. He also serves as Chief Information Officer for Baker Consulting Associates based in Dallas, Texas. As a student at Cornell University, Mr. Baker won over 100 speech and debate awards. After Cornell, Mr. Baker worked at the International Association for Religious Freedom before becoming a social entrepreneur. He founded both the New York Urban Debate League and the Malcolm X Prison Debate Initiative at Rikers Island. In 2003, as head of the NYU Policy Debate Team, Mr. Baker became the first African-American director to win the national championship since Melvin Tolson of Wiley College in 1935. Since then, Mr. Baker has overseen top national finishes for nearly 20 years in a row. Mr. Baker is also a member of the IPPF Advisory Board. Mr. Marshall Donat is the former Vice President and Senior Counsel for Marriott International. Prior to this, he served as Vice President and Associate General Counsel for Starwood Hotels and Resorts Worldwide, Incorporated. Mr. Donat's work in hospitality law involved contract owner relations, hotel management, franchise development, and mixed-use condominium hotel contracts. Prior to joining Starwood, he was the General Counsel for the North American Division of Club Med, Inc., headquartered in New York City. He also served as Associate Counsel for Pan American World Airways. Mr. Donat is a longtime supporter and judge of the IPPF. Ladies and gentlemen, please a round of applause for our moderator and judges. A quick reminder for those in the audience to please silence your cell phones. Also, the semifinals are being broadcast live on the IPPF Facebook page if parents back home are interested in watching. I will now turn things over to Mr. Baker.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We will begin the debate with two opening speeches, 8 minutes each. The first by the affirmative, the second by the negative. You may start.
Imagine a world of unending bloodshed and conquest, where peace is nothing but a dream. This was the reality that our ancestors faced for centuries, and one that re-emerged with the culmination of the long and bloody Second World War. 4 years after the fighting had ceased, a group of 12 American and European nations came together to sign a treaty. Shouldering the burdens and fears and atrocities that the previous war had brought, this treaty resulted in the birth of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, an alliance committed to preserving global stability. Now, more than 70 years later, NATO has continued to act as a cornerstone of international cooperation, inspiring nations around the world. The collaboration fostered by the alliance has brought in an era of undisputed peace and prosperity, solidifying NATO's role as a supranational collective that has transcended both time and borders. For these reasons and more, we proudly affirm that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is an effective model for international cooperation. Historically, NATO has contributed to global cooperation in 3 key ways. The first is through the military. Cooperative deterrence lies at the heart of NATO, enshrined in its Article 5, which deems an attack on one as an attack on all. Through collaborative task forces such as the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, NATO structures ensure it is ready to defend its members on a hair-trigger alert in the event of an attack. Furthermore, through joint training operations, standardization, and routine multinational military exercises, NATO members ensure military preparedness, strength, stability, and unity. For example, just one operation in the past involved over 23 NATO members and partners, streamlining information sharing and fostering interoperability. Empirically, this cooperation has been vital. As Heinz finds, NATO's coordination directly counterbalanced the Soviet Union's superior conventional capabilities, maintaining the tense peace of the Cold War and ensuring the war remained cold. More recently, in the invasion of Ukraine, NATO's swift and decisive support has acted as the only credible deterrent of further Russian incursions, keeping Russia at bay and preventing further escalation. Indeed, the unified coalition has been pivotal in turning the tides of the war, with NATO's support and unprecedented amounts of advanced weapons enabling Ukraine to launch a months-long counteroffensive in September. Through the unwavering cooperation of NATO, almost half of the land taken by Russia has been reclaimed, offering hope for 13 million displaced individuals and millions more without access to basic necessities like clean water, electricity, and food. The second way that NATO has preserved the peace is through diplomacy. The primary tool of NATO's arsenal is diplomacy, which the alliance utilizes in 2 key ways. The first is conflict mediation, which is central to NATO's cooperation strategy. NATO's North Atlantic Council is a vital part of the alliance. Any member state can raise disputes, promoting consultation among all member state ambassadors. NATO's strategic concept, initiated after the Lisbon Summit, encouraged dialogue and fostered partnerships with regions like Eurasia, the Mediterranean, and the Middle East, and even adversaries like Russia and Afghanistan. As a result, NATO's expansion led to unprecedented peace in Eastern Europe, laying the foundation for unprecedented agreements, resulting in stable interstate borders and agreements. These efforts have prevented entire wars in Macedonia and Serbia and led to a NATO-mediated agreement between Greece and Turkey to limit military confrontation. NATO's second diplomatic tool is global partnerships. NATO's partnerships with non-member states have fostered collaboration as its interests expand beyond Europe. Engaging in dialogue and cooperation with over 40 partner countries, NATO enhances its security while participating in global initiatives. Through the Partnership for Peace program, over 21 states from Europe to Asia collaborate on interoperability, defense planning, and participate in key NATO dialogue, allowing nations outside of Europe to contribute to collective security. For example, states like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia have joined NATO-led missions, such as the ISAF in Afghanistan. NATO's Istanbul Cooperation Initiative has also fostered over 15 years of bilateral security cooperation with Middle Eastern nations, which have been crucial in supporting NATO operations. For instance, Qatar and the UAE contributed aircraft to NATO's Libya operation, and Gulf countries collaborated in counter-piracy efforts. Over the past decades, NATO has built partnerships with countries in the Euro-Atlantic, Mediterranean, Gulf regions, and beyond, exemplifying a positive model of international cooperation. The third place NATO has fostered cooperation is the economy. NATO has been key to fostering economic growth through the world in 2 key ways. First is through directly facilitating economic growth in member states, as NATO policies commit member states to free market policies and liberalized trade, promoting economic collaboration between members and boosting growth. These policies directly led to record levels of foreign investment into new member states. Indeed, after joining NATO, foreign investment in Central Europe skyrocketed by 318%. Moreover, NATO hosts numerous committees, infrastructure development, and special programs to prompt growth in less developed member states. For example, NATO's Economic and Security Committee helps member nations manage international economic transitions, combat crime, and also coordinate trade policies. And naturally, growth has skyrocketed. This so-called NATO effect resulted in immediate economic growth, which doubled exports and imports, decreased unemployment, and reduced poverty, directly improving the living standards for millions. Second, NATO also keeps global trade safe. By 2010, piracy off the coast of Somalia was devastating global trade, with 489 attacks annually. And this had devastating implications, because 80% of international trade passed through the nearby Gulf of Aden, and crucial humanitarian assistance relied on the waterway. Indeed, the piracy cost the global economy $18 billion per year while crushing the economies of neighboring East African countries. NATO began Operation Ocean Shield, a widely successful anti-piracy initiative that reduced the number of successful pirate attacks from 236 in 2011 to just 0 from May 2012 to the operation's conclusion. And international cooperation was the foundation of the operation, with every NATO member contributing either directly or indirectly through NATO's command structures and common funding. Additionally, NATO partner states, as well as China and Russia, provided instrumental support in the operation, ensuring its success. And ultimately, without NATO presence deterring attacks and protecting the trade, the situation would have been far worse, affecting the world trade and economy enormously. NATO structure facilitated cooperation and promoted an unprecedented level of naval peace and security. And for these reasons, we are more than proud to affirm.
Negative opening speech, 8 minutes.
It is easy for affirmative to glorify NATO through an Americanized, Western-centric perspective. But the reality is, NATO's model is exceptionally restrictive. It is a model that can only succeed in a specific set of situations in Europe and neglects functionality in more vulnerable regions around the world. On negative, we will discuss two things. First, on definitions and burdens, and secondly, our two constructive arguments. One, that NATO's model is ineffective at maintaining cooperation between member states, and two, that NATO's model increases the likelihood of conflict with external aggressors. Firstly, on definitions. The definition of an effective model has two layers. First, an effective model must be able to achieve an organization's set out purpose, so in NATO's case, that purpose is international cooperation. Second, an effective model must also have the ability to be sufficiently applied to a variety of economic, geographic, and historical contexts. And crucially, this definition suggests that the affirmative has two burdens. Firstly, the affirmative needs to prove that NATO has been successful in fostering international cooperation. And secondly, and more importantly, that this model can be adequately applied to other regions. Therefore, it's not enough for affirmative to simply identify the successes of NATO. These successes must be connected to NATO's model itself, rather than any other exogenous factor that might contribute to NATO's success. For instance, when the affirmative references negotiations between nations, they must properly explain why it is uniquely NATO's contributions that increase negotiations, rather than the long history between EU members that creates strong allyship. Lastly, what do we support on negative? We will defend a non-NATO world. We don't support or stand for one model of cooperation. We are fine with a variety of other combinations of other alternatives, including bilateral ad hoc deals with smaller organizations. However, this debate is not hinged on proving that the alternative is better or worse, because even if it's true that our alternative is worse than the status quo's model of NATO, this doesn't disprove our case that NATO's model is inherently ineffective. First argument. NATO's model is ineffective at maintaining cooperation between states. The thesis of this claim is that NATO's organizational structure limits cooperation between member states, and there are 5 reasons for why this is true. 1. NATO's model uniquely establishes a collective action problem. Although all states want to gain utility from NATO membership, not all are willing to invest into the collective benefit of that membership. According to Andrew Galani at Cornell University, this is illustrated by the massive disparities in spending targets. In fact, less than a third of countries meet this 2% spending requirement. As a result, the dependency of funding is centralized and concentrated on a very few stakeholders, such as the US. There are 2 crucial implications of this. A, In other developing regions, such as those in the Middle East or Asia, this system of economic dependence is very unsustainable. The economic sacrifices of one nation are insufficient to support the entire alliance, especially in the instance that every nation has an unstable political, military, or economic situation. But B, even if it is the case that this model is sustainable under heavy dependency of one nation, this allows that one member state to disproportionately weaponize NATO for their own self-interests. For instance, the US's use of NATO to aid its baseless operations in Iraq. The US and other actors are able to use this organization with the leverage that it can revoke its funding and dependency from other nations. When NATO becomes immensely reliant on the geopolitical context of the US, it forces the rest of NATO allies to pivot towards their own geopolitical interests. The second reason for why this argument is true is that NATO is hinged on the questionable principle of equal representation, even though some countries are affected more by NATO. Eastern European nations that border Russia are affected far more by policy outcomes by the virtue of the fact that they're geographically closer to Russia. However, countries like the US or Luxembourg have an equal voice to dictate what the organization's decision-making looks like, which is a power distribution that is not reflective of the reality of this organization. This problem is more serious in other contexts. If NATO's model were to be applied to other states in the South China Sea, for instance, nations such as Taiwan might favor rapid military developments, whereas nations in Vietnam would be adverse to any of those advancements because of its economic relations with China. 3, on inefficiency. It is often the case that NATO member states are unable to agree on a particular policy, creating inefficiency. For instance, the question of Libya's military operations. The problem is, all nations have the power to veto any decision. When consistent vetoes are used, gridlock and extensive negotiations follow. When this model is applied to other regions, this problem may also be exacerbated. It looks like policymaking being held hostage through vetoes when Turkey vetoes the accession of Sweden and Finland into NATO for an exchange on concessions on other critical policymaking issues. And crucially, this is the reason as to why NATO is ineffective at interventions. Because of the veto system, it is very difficult to sustain a war effort when all members must gain concessions from other nations who initially oppose an intervention. That means that this support can only go for so long when lives and money is lost. Thus, all the escalation to initiate a conflict occurs, but none of the de-escalation in the long term actually occurs. That is why the war effort post-Libya was cut short after killing Gaddafi, leaving Libya in an unstable and economic political situation in the long term. But 4, there are no effective measures of conflict resolution within the organization. The only vehicles of voicing and leveraging a nation's displeasure are ineffective through the silence procedure, which many nations don't even use to begin with. Therefore, the vast majority of nations voice their displeasure by cutting back funding. According to Ryan Brown, this is exactly what the US has done under the Trump administration when voicing their displeasure with the lack of funding from other nations. He substantially cut back on funding by a third in 2019, for instance. In the same way, we envision that in other contexts outside of Europe, states will voice their displeasure by cutting back on funding. A lesser funded NATO means that the risk of those nations going rogue increases, because if those states receive less protection and less support from NATO itself, that leads to a cycle of less commitment into the long term and therefore less funding. And lastly, it is not guaranteed by any way that these treaty members, when faced by an armed attack, will even support the alliance through Article 5. There is no binding agreement that establishes punitive consequences for nations that fail to cooperate within Article 5. Just this year, in fact, within CSTO, an organization very similar to the structure of NATO, Armenia faced a direct military assault from Azerbaijan's military ventures. Armenia asked for support from their alliance, but CSTO did not provide any military support to that region. On to the second argument. NATO's model exacerbates conflict between states. NATO's actions have undermined member security and commitment, and this is for 2 reasons. 1, NATO's model is heavily reliant on expansion, but note that this exposes members to risk of military escalation. According to Ted Carpenter, a journalist for The Guardian, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Putin actually initially attempted to facilitate peace with the West, going as far as offering Russian entry directly into NATO. But these diplomatic attempts were ignored. In fact, NATO subsequently underwent 5 rounds of enlargement, incorporating several states that shared borders with Russia. Russia also has publicly expressed NATO's rapid expansion. In December of 2022, Putin said, and I quote, "You promised us in the 1990s that NATO would not move an inch to the east. You cheated us shamelessly. Trust is substantially reduced under the side of negative, and that is why we negate."
Thank you. 90 seconds to think a little, and we'll have second speeches from both sides. Second speech from the affirmative for a period of 5 minutes. And you can start as soon as I get there. Here I go. Okay.
Thank you. The most important thing to remember in this round is the comparative. Nothing is perfect given the complexities of the world which we live in, which is why it is so critical that we analyze NATO's net effects holistically, rather than merely considering specific and isolated incidents which the negation provides. Let's look at the evidence. NATO put an end to an era of bloodshed, thousands of years of war. Through collective defense and unprecedented strides for peace, no NATO member has ever been attacked since its establishment 70 years ago. NATO's model is fundamentally cooperative, with every action taken only after negotiations and only after unanimous consensus. Let's discuss their arguments. They start by providing this definition of modelability. However, the real world is complex. Of course, every country and region is different, which is why exact replication is impossible and not our burden of proof. Instead, it is important to look at the fundamental premise of NATO's nature, which, as I have established, is one built on cooperation, and to look at how this cooperation has been applied not only within NATO, but to other organizations around the world. The existence of transnational military diplomatic alliances, such as the African Union of 55 states, the Baghdad Pact, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, AUKUS, and more, prove my opponents wrong and prove that this fundamental principle of cooperation has been facilitated through NATO. Second, the motivations for NATO's creation will always exist. Remember, nations such as China and Iran still instill fear across the globe, which means that across the world, we are always going to be seeing the need for mutual defense agreements like NATO. And finally, we observe that when looking at the modelability of NATO, we must look to cases where the countries have followed NATO's model. If the countries have strayed away, such as in the CSTO example they start, that is not an indicator of NATO's model, but rather the actions of individual countries. Let's talk about their first argument about burden sharing. Firstly, the 2% spending contribution guideline is misunderstood. The 2% target only talks about spending on domestic military, not contributions to NATO. This distinction is critical because when we look at NATO structure employs a fundamental formula which is calculated based on proportion of GDP and income spending, which is universally agreed with all the NATO countries to dictate contributions to NATO. There is equal burden sharing. Second, When we look to the future, the trend is positive. Throughout 2021 and 2022, 16 NATO members significantly increased their spending, even through a global decline in military spending and a pandemic, which is why the number of countries meeting the spending target is only projected to grow from 3 to 11 in the next 6 years, and the majority of members are projected to exceed the 2% target by next year. Finally, unequal burden sharing is not inherent to NATO's structure. It is due to the vastly different economic capacities of its member states. If NATO's model were applied elsewhere, that means that the financial contributions from members would similarly mirror the different sizes, and this is what the proportional model of NATO contribution spending does. Then, they also mention the fact about veto and the slow process of deliberation. However, let's use their own example of Turkey. In every single instance where Turkey has vetoed, the veto has been lifted. In the Baltics, with Austria, with Finland's ascension onto NATO, all of the times have been resolved, and they have been resolved because NATO's model is one which inherently facilitates the talks, which are necessary to get over these differences. We would say it is better to have these delays and let these countries express their concerns, because otherwise, if they are not able to voice their opinions, they consistently brew this unsatisfaction with the alliance. The fundamental principle of cooperation involves discussion. Discussion is not a harm to NATO structure. Finally, they mention Russia. However, NATO is not the cause of Russian aggression. There are so many other reasons for this, and especially because NATO never agreed to offer Ukraine permanent membership. Let's talk about some of the other reasons. First, whenever Putin invades, he has historically experienced large amounts of public support, especially in a time where Putin's throne and claim to power is so fragile domestically. This is a huge incentive for Putin to invade. But second of all, the Russian revisionist policy has been developed